Welcome to the program Hidden Treasures, a program intended to clarify the doubts that we come across when we read the Holy Bible or when we listen to the scripture. Of course, we have doubts, and what do we do with them? And here is the opportunity. We address them to Reverend Dr. Michael Carrimittum, a renowned Bible scholar and a scripture professor in the seminary. Father, we are very happy to have you with us today for this episode. Of course, we have been going through a number of episodes. And for this episode, we have a question from the book of Deuteronomy. First of all, the very word itself, more than any passage in particular, the very word Deuteronomy, what does it mean? And the second question, why is it called so? And in connection with that, we are told and taught that Moses is the author. Is he the author? Why this question about the authorship? Because if he is the author, how could he himself write about his death, about the burial and the last minutes of his life? So how do we explain these things? How do we understand this? First of all, the name Deuteronomy. Secondly, what does it mean? Third, about the authorship of Moses. That is questionable only on account of the reason that if he is the author, he himself writes about his death account.
Okay.
So,
I think it is important to know what this Deuteronomy means, what is the content, what is the situation in which this was written, and why it is attributed to Moses, etc. First thing we have to keep in mind, this belongs to the collection called the Torah, 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So these 5 books or 5 scrolls, Pentateuch. In Greek you call Pentateuch, the 5 scrolls, or in Hebrew you call Torah, the law or instruction. So the 5 books are attributed to Moses because of the importance. I will come to the Moses authority later. So now, why this book is called Deuteronomy? Is it the name in Hebrew? No. First of all, this comes from a false understanding of a particular verse in the book. For example, if you take chapter 17, verse 18, we have the origin of this name. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18.
Shall I read that, Father?
Yeah, please, please.
And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, from that which is in charge of the Levitical priest.
Okay. A copy of this. That's
law. Copy of this law.
Yeah, copy of this law. The word copy of this law is from Hebrew. When it was translated into Greek, they put the word Deuteronomion. A copy of the law has become a second law. Deutero means second. Proto means first.
Yeah.
Proto, deutero, trito. So the deutero means second, and nomion, the second law. So the word that should have been as the copy of the law has become a second law. So the question is, when the king ascends his throne, they should make a copy of the law. This law should be kept in his treasury, and he must read again and again. So a copy of the law has become a second law. In fact, this is not a second law, but something more. So the Deuteronomy means second law, but that's not exactly what it is. Very often, the Septuagint titles of the book are not very accurate. We saw, for example, Numbers, arithmoi.
Yeah.
Numbers is arithmoi. This is nothing like arithmetic. In fact, in the Hebrew, it is called Bamidbar, in the desert. The same way, if you take the Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, you have the Hebrew word, Ele Hadebarim.
Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel.
Okay, the Hebrew word usually is the first 2 or 3 words of the book. Here it is Ele Ha-Debarim. These are the words. And so that gives more indication to the content of the book, the words of Moses. So now, what is the context? So these are the words of Moses. What is the context of the book of Deuteronomy? How was it written? Why was it written? We know the book of Deuteronomy is presented as the last words of Moses. The historical context the book presents is not exactly the historical context in which the book came into existence. So let us see first how the book presents itself. So the authors present the book of Deuteronomy as the last words of Moses. The situation is this. People are on the threshold of the promised land. And Moses is aware that he will not be there when the people enter the promised land. God has not allowed him to enter the promised land. So when the people enter the promised land, he will not be there to guide them. Now, who is going to guide them? God has to. So what will be the situation the people are going to face? What are the troubles they will be facing? How to confront this? So Moses is telling them who they are, what God has done, how they have experienced God's protection from the time God intervened in Egypt and brought them through the desert and to this place. So you should remember. You should remember your past. And you should also remember that you are a special people, that God has done all this for you, and also God has demanded the covenant. You are a people of covenant, and the covenant is based on very concrete demands, the commandments. And you have the Ark of the Covenant with you, and you should always read that commandment. So Moses is telling them to remain faithful again and again. In fact, there are 3 discourses of Moses, put one after the other, asking the people to remain faithful. There is an insistence. And especially when you come to the last part of the thing, there's curses and blessing of the people who remain faithful, or you don't remain faithful. And there is a necessity of offering sacrifice only in one particular place, the need of the how to do about the kings and what about the prophets, etc. So there is an emphasis on the obedience to the law. And he said, God has called you and God is demanding you this. Why this? Or who wrote this? Now, the biblical scholars are convinced that this is not exactly written by Moses. First of all, as you said, if Moses was the author, they would not have been writing his death and burial. Maybe the chapter 34 could have been added later by Joshua and the rest. But if you see the whole language, the whole emphasis on Jerusalem, emphasis on the prophet, etc., and many other emphasis. You see, this is not written during the time of wandering, nor during the initial stage of monarchy. So they say there is a group of people who they call the Deuteronomist theologians, who came into existence in the 8th century after the destruction of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, Israel, fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC because they were unfaithful to the law. Yes. So we see that the Sinai covenant was breached, the conditions were not fulfilled, and God has punished the people according to the covenant. 10 tribes of the 12 have disappeared from the face of the earth. Now, this is going to happen, the same thing happened to the next one tribe. So 1.5. Benjamin and Judah together forms Judah, the tribe of Judah, that is Jerusalem. So what happened to the northern kingdom can also happen to the southern kingdom. So unless you are careful, unless you are faithful to the covenant, the same thing happened to you. So there is an urgency. Because there is an example of the northern kingdom totally disappeared. 10 tribes are gone, and this is only surviving. And there is all the reason to believe, to fear that this will happen to Judah also. So if you continue in the ways of the northern kingdom, you will be destroyed. So now, in order to instill such confidence of obedience to the law, the people are writing this as Moses is writing. So there is no question of authorship in that time. So there are various types of authorships. For example, the biblical authorship, the one who writes by himself. For Paul writing the letters, or Luke writing the gospel, this is a person who writes. That's the one thing. The second is one who dictates. For example, Peter was dictating was giving the idea, the secretary. Paul was writing through the secretary. And now at the Galatians he says, see with how much big letters I am writing. So a person who writes himself, a person who uses a secretary, his own ideas. The third can be the disciples of a person gathers the material. For example, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Jeremiah did not write himself or something except. So there is the third authorship. There is the one who the disciples collect the ideas and put them together. And the fourth type of authorship is you collect the ideas and you attribute. So the thinking pattern of an ancient person, like Moses or Abraham or Isaiah, especially Moses. These ideas are taken and put in a particular context as if he is speaking. The whole words are put into his mouth. It's nothing against him, but not exactly what he is telling. So that also is considered as an author. They did not have that understanding of an author as we have today. Even, for example, then we say editor or a disciple. But so here, they didn't have any qualms of conscience that they were not saying something wrong that Moses wrote it. For example, the parables of Jesus. He didn't, there was nobody going with a tape recorder. No? They did not have a voice recorder. And this has been spoken, the same parable is spoken several various ways. So Luke is writing the parable of Jesus in one way, Mark is in another way. The idea remains the same, but the words are different. So there is no question of a kind of literal writing by the author. So now they did not have a question of conscience telling that Moses did write this. So Moses has the authority, they're using the authority of Moses, but at the same time they call it the Deuteronomy, or the interpretation of. So what Moses has done, we have seen on the 10 Commandments, for example, there is a time of Moses. But then it is reinterpreted, interpreted in a different situation. So what happened in the time of Moses in the Mount Sinai and the wanderings of community, it's a totally different situation than what is happening when they are settled, and now they are threatened with an attack. So they are towards the end of monarchy. They say it is during the time of Hezekiah or even Josiah, that is the end of the 7th century BC or the beginning of the 6th century BC, that the book of Deuteronomy came into. And the Deuteronomy is also not as one book. They call the Code of Deuteronomy, that is in chapter 12 to 26. That seems to be the heart of the Deuteronomic Code. And this was written in Shechem sometime in the 8th century after the destruction of the northern kingdom, and brought to Jerusalem and was deposited in the treasury. During the time of Hezekiah, the renewal of the temple, they found the code, the law. So that's a kind of, and that's later on taken and augmented by the time of Josiah. So it has a long history behind it. So when you say Deuteronomy is attributed to Moses as Genesis and all the 5 books, but it takes the spirit, absorbs the spirit of the covenant that was somehow revealed through Moses, not exactly the words. So this is the Deuteronomy, and then the reason why is they are on the verge of losing everything. Unless and until you remain faithful to the covenant of the Lord, you will be totally wiped out. So that is all the curses coming in. Now, what is he doing? Moses is reminding the people, so to say. The people are being reminded through the words of Moses what we have been. So what God has done for you. That is an interesting thing. What Jesus did, the Last Supper. At the institution of the Eucharist, see how Jesus said, do this in memory of me. Remember. Anamnesis. Remember. And I think the most serious illness today is amnesia.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of anamnesis, you have amnesia. And I have this problem, amnesia. You forget. And forgetting is fatal. You forget who you are.
You forget surroundings, you forget what has been done.
Exactly, you should not forget who you were. You were a slave in Egypt. And I have brought you out with an outstretched arm. You are mine, I have taken you out of slavery. I have made you my child. I have made a covenant with you. You are my son. Today I have begotten you, so to say. No? So the people are chosen by God, protected by God, defended, and God has given a land. And remember, the covenant. A very important, the command, the fourth commandment. In the seminary, I ask the students very often, you know the fourth commandment? Of course we know the fourth commandment. What is it? You shall honor your father and mother. Is that all? There's nothing more. In fact, this is the only commandment
with a promise
with a promise. And the promise is, in order to remain, in order to have a long life, in order to have a long life in the land that I will give you, honor your father and mother. That doesn't mean long life. It's not 100 years. If you want to be in my land, if you want to be my people, you should obey my commandment. That's it. It's not whether you live for 80 years or 100 years. If you want to be my people, if you want to be in my land, you should remain faithful to me. So that is what this meant. So the covenant, obedience to the covenant is so substantial, so necessary in order to remain God's people. So this is what Moses is telling. You remember what God has done for you. And that's why in chapter 26 he said, when you bring your first fruits offering, remember, tell, my father was a wandering Aramean. And he came with a few people into Egypt and he was made as slaves. And from there, God brought me out. Right. So remember, that is very important for us also. Remember who we are. Without God's grace, God's protection, what can we do? We think we are big people, we are very, I don't know what. If He withdraws the sustaining hand, you fall to nothing. So the book of Deuteronomy is reminding us that we have to remember what God has done. And that is the most important commandment. For example, a lawyer came to test Jesus and asked, what is the most important commandment of the law? And he said, you tell, what do you read in the text? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. That is the Hebrew. That's what they call every day they are praying. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And this law should be in your heart, should be on your heart. It should remain. When you get up, you should think about it. When you're going to bed, you think about it. You write it on the doorpost and on the walls, and you speak to the children about it. So this is what Deuteronomy is. The first part, so from 1 to 11, tells us what God has done and the importance of reminding the people. Then comes from 12 to 26, the laws and the curse, and then this is again repeated. So Deuteronomy is a book written sometime in the 8th century or beginning of 7th century, just before the exile, reminding the people of the necessity of remaining faithful to God. And that's what Jeremiah was again and again insisting, but people did not. And we see what happened. In 587, the same thing happened as what happened to the northern kingdom in 721. Babylon defeated Jerusalem first in 798. 10 years later, they came, Nebuchadnezzar's army, destroyed the temple, they destroyed the city, and took thousands and thousands as captives. And the monarchy came to an end. So this is Deuteronomy. Unless you remain faithful, unless you remember what God has done for you and remain faithful to His covenant and commandments, you will not be my people. So this is a very, very important book. At the same time, this is the closest book to the New Testament, because this speaks about the heart, the letter, the law written in the heart. Jeremiah was speaking about the law written in the heart. Ezekiel was speaking about the law written in the heart. And the Deuteronomy is insisting heart is important. So love your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. So rather than the external activities, celebrations, rituals, be faithful to God. Remember what God has done and obey with all your heart. And the obedience comes first, love, the love commandments. So that is the book of Deuteronomy is the closest book to the New Testament because it emphasizes on the interiority of the law, the importance of the heart, and the importance of love. The other things comes, okay, there's a lot of things, a reinterpretation of the law. The Deuteronomy means the interiorizing, reinterpretation of the law, the rituals and other things given in the books of Exodus, Numbers and Leviticus. So this is the Deuteronomy, the second law, the new law, the interior law.
As we listen to this, we have understood Deuteronomy is a very important book. And the reason mentioned is something that should come to the heart, because it is a reminder of what God has done, and then to be faithful. Otherwise, we will not belong to the people of God. We will not be in His land. And thereby it comes very relevant, as Father mentioned about the New Testament, where the emphasis to the heart. And therefore the interiority is very important. Therefore the law is not the external things, as Father said. Rather, it is the inner being that holds the law in the heart and obeys that. And therefore, the meaning of that, of course, as we discussed, we understood maybe the authorship could be because, there are several ways of authorship, maybe because can be directly written or maybe dictated. However, it could be in the context where the words are attributed to Moses. But more than that, what is relevant is the message of this particular book as we listen to. An important book because it speaks of the interiority of the law kept in the heart, and thereby belonging to God and living as people of the land of God. Thank you for watching this program, and we see you next week for the same time, same program. And if you have any questions or any doubts that come up in your mind, you're free to ask those questions. Write to us in the following address that is on the television. Until then, stay blessed. And Father, thank you so much. Thank you, Father.